Never show a visual aid until you've already seen it yourself. That's what they say on all the good education courses. Sound advice, you've probably heard it many times. And under the pressure of real school life, probably many times had to ignore it as well. The intentions were there, but in the end there just wasn't time. So, from the 15-minute sections of this program, we've put together a sequence of short clips as a preview. They won't sketch out the full line of inquiry, but they should give a flavor of some of the issues we're going to look at. I'm Paul Jones, a television presenter interested in the Bible, rather than a Bible expert interested in television, so I've had to do my research on the subject. This edit suite is my base. On these monitors, I call up various pieces of evidence to be considered. In this first section, we're going to be looking at questions to do with it all happening a long time ago. Could what we have in the Bible today be anything like what was in the originals?
I don't really think a lot of the Bible, to be honest.
It's written such a long time ago.
Obviously, over the years, different bits have been added and changed. It was sort of passed on generations and exaggerated.
Down the years, it would be changed quite a lot.
I wouldn't have thought it'd be very accurate now.
Stories tend to get changed over years, and it's been a hell of a lot of years since it was written.
In response to these questions, I try to draw some parallels from modern life to illustrate aspects of how the Bible came together and how it reached us. We look at what future generations might make of recent events and influences. At a recent New York World's Fair, a number of items were collected together which people considered would be of value to future generations. I've made a collection of items of personal value to me. Viewers are invited to think of their own. We use these examples to explore parallels with the collection of writings passed on to us in the form of the Bible. As we say in the program, it's much more difficult to keep a story alive, accurate, and working in history than to bury it at the bottom of the garden. So, in the case of the Bible, the way information was recorded and copies passed on is examined. We look at examples of manuscripts, but we also have our in-studio computer to help. Now let's look at a central event in the Bible, the life of Jesus. Accounts were written with particular people in mind. They decided the contents should be passed on, so copies were made, and copies of copies. Some wore out, some were lost, including the originals. So, as they would do for any other writing of a similar age, historians work from the copies we have. This is a Hebrew scroll of the first 5 books of the Bible. If you unrolled it fully, it would stretch over 100 feet. It contains 69,000 words. You imagine copying out that lot by hand in neat, regular letters like this, using a quill pen and a pot of charcoal and vegetable oil. It makes 500 lines look like a complete let-off. Hebrew scrolls of the Old Testament had to be without any mistake or blemish. One mistake meant beginning a whole new skin. What about before records were written and the accuracy of accounts relied on memory? We look at that too. The stages of our inquiry are posted on the screen by captions, usually in the form of questions. At the end of the program, we post the questions back on screen as a reminder of what we've looked at, along with visual clips from the program to jerk the memory. Before the program for our main audience begins, here's the reprise section those viewers will see at the end of the first part. We do not normally recommend showing more than one part of the program at a single sitting. As an addition to help pupils with further inquiry, we produce visual resource books linked with the program. They are sold as separate items. Full details are in the teacher's notes. The program follows in 10 seconds.
Okay, where should we start?
Yes, put up tape 2, and we're looking for take 4. This is the age of instant communication. Even if we weren't actually there, we can all see what went on. Today's technology allows us to transmit the news as it happens to almost anywhere in the world. And if we miss the first broadcast, we can always catch up later. Vast amounts of information are being stored away on tape or computer disk. Most of it will only be kept for a while, but there is some information that's so valuable it'll never be allowed to get lost. One of the safest places for keeping objects protected from fire, explosion or war is under the ground. It was done regularly during World War II, and it's been done on numerous occasions since. Sometimes the objects protected were vital government records. At other times they were just things that ordinary people thought were important. We go into the studio now on the next tape.
Okay.
At the New York World Fair in 1964, they buried a time capsule. Those who compiled the capsule felt that each item contained ideas that were of value to the world as a whole and should be passed on to future generations. Your personal choice might be completely different. Say you were asked to pick 10 items that were important enough for you to want them to remain safe, whatever else happened, as a reminder of you. What would you choose? Well, this is my collection. Records I've played on, press cuttings and posters for my film and theatre performances, a cartoon from Punch, cassettes of TV programs, the tools of my trade. I've been in front of the camera quite a lot, but like many actors and performers, I've always wanted to be involved in what goes on behind it and help to make the program. So here I've included many of the things that interest me. Music, the theatre, a bit of sport, and something that's interested me since I got to know more about it, the Bible. I'm not a Bible expert, so like a good program maker, I've had to do my homework by way of research. Interestingly enough, the Bible's the only item in my collection which was also chosen by those putting together the World's Fair capsule. And the Bible itself is rather like a time capsule. It's a collection of writings based on many people's memories of events and recorded over many centuries. The writings were finally collected together about the year 300 by people who were convinced they were of extreme value to future generations. In fact, they believed the material they were handling was inspired by God himself. Could it be that this is like a time capsule from God, put together by people? Christians believe that in a number of ways it is. Jews and Muslims don't attach the same importance to every part, but they too believe it started with God and that he had something important to say to them. This possibility of an almighty God inspiring people to write and put together his message for the human race makes this one of the most potentially exciting collections of information ever put together. But this sense of excitement doesn't always come across from everyone.
I don't really think a lot of the Bible, to be honest.
It's written such a long time ago.
Obviously, over the years, different bits have been added and changed. It was sort of passed on generations and exaggerated.
Down the years, it would be changed quite a lot.
I wouldn't have thought it'd be very accurate now.
Stories tend to get changed over years, and it's been a hell of a lot of years since it was written.
Well, how do we know it hasn't got changed en route? Have you got the originals?
Right, caption that question, will you? I've been looking into this. No, we haven't got any of the originals, and we wouldn't expect to for something of that age. But what we do have is a strong history of documentation.
Well, sounds good. What does it mean?
It means we've got a lot of written documents which provide strong evidence for what's in the original. Look, let's play around with the graphics on this micro. Take any historical event, a battle, for instance. The general who won is proud of this achievement. He wants a permanent record, so he orders a scribe to write about it. He wants everyone else to know, so copies are made. Now let's look at a central event in the Bible, the life of Jesus. Accounts were written with particular people in mind. They decided the contents should be passed on, so copies were made, and copies of copies. Some wore out, some were lost, including the originals. So, as they would do for any other writing of a similar age, historians work from the copies we have. Let's see how they do it. This line represents years from 500 BC to AD 1600. When historians try to piece together evidence for the original, they look for two things: the number of good copies and the time gap between the oldest existing copy and the date of the original. You remember Julius Caesar?
Oh, yes. Close friends.
Shortly before the books of the New Testament were written, he wrote accounts of some of his wars. We have 10 copies. The oldest is dated by historians about the year 900. That's a gap of around 1,000 years. Or take Plato, another famous name from the past. He wrote his books of philosophy some 300 or 400 years BC. The earliest existing manuscript is dated around AD 900. So the time gap is roughly 1,200 years, and we have only 7 copies. But in both cases, historians still believe that's reasonable evidence. Most of the books of the New Testament were written in the second part of the 1st century AD. We have part of a manuscript dated only 60 to 70 years later, and full manuscripts only 250 years later. And if that sounds impressive, look at the number of copies we have. This is an estimation. Some say there could easily be more.
Impressive. But why were there so many copies of the New Testament?
Well, it's always been a bestseller, perhaps because it sees something more in life than what's immediately obvious, and that's always meant something to people.
Well, I suppose if you're going to copy that lot by hand, you've got to believe it's important.
Yes, and not just copy it with your feet up while you're thinking about something else either. Nowadays, we can get a document copied by just pressing a button, but it hasn't always been like that. If it's the number of New Testament manuscripts that's impressive, when we turn to the Old Testament, it's the extraordinary care which we know the scribes took with their work. This is a Hebrew scroll of the first 5 books of the Bible. If you unrolled it fully, it would stretch over 100 feet. It contains 69,000 words. You imagine copying out that lot by hand in neat, regular letters like this, using a quill pen and a pot of charcoal and vegetable oil. It makes 500 lines look like a complete let-off. In fact, at a recent exhibition, visitors were invited to help copy out parts of the Bible. Over 2,000 people took part, with an average of 10 working at one time. In 30 hours, they completed about a quarter of the total length, and the standard of handwriting and general presentation doesn't quite match up. For the Hebrew scrolls of the Old Testament had to be without any mistake or blemish. One mistake meant beginning a whole new skin. So if you went wrong here, you would have to go right back to there. And if the mistake involved the name of God, the whole thing had to be discarded and begun again. What's more, the checking was incredibly strict. Some of the scribes used complicated safeguards to make sure nothing was left out, like counting all the verses, words, and letters in each book, and sometimes even counting how many times each letter of the alphabet occurred in each book. I know it all sounds amazing, but they saw their work as no ordinary copying exercise. These were writings inspired by God, and this is the way they showed reverence for them. Later Christians came to see the Gospels and the other books now in the New Testament as inspired in the same way. But we can do better than just say they were very careful. We can compare the results. Let's go back and look at the old family tree of documents. Take 2 copies from the branches of the tree. If they are to all intents and purposes the same, we can assume they come from the same source. Now, if they're on branches a long way apart and still highly similar, we can assume the common source is a long way back. And the accuracy has been maintained over a lot of copies in between.
Yes, but how do we know they've not just been copied from each other?
Partly because we know where they came from. A number of cities around the Mediterranean became important centers of learning. The branches of our tree spread to and out from these rather distant cities. We know that because each city had its own style which today's scholars recognize. Rather as you would recognize I came from a different place from somebody else. If I spoke like this and he spoke like that. We don't expect the copies to match exactly. In fact, the small differences in the text, like the way place names are spelt, are one of the ways scholars use to identify the city. But they're a great deal more similar than they are different, and in very few places does the difference affect the meaning at all. We've got a good quote from Sir Frederick Kenyon. He used to be director of the British Museum.
No other ancient book has anything like such early and plentiful testimony to its text. And no unbiased scholar would deny that the text that has come down to us is substantially sound.
What he's saying is that for no other similar writings is there such strong evidence that what we've got today is the same to all intents and purposes as the originals. And from a director of the British Museum, that must mean something.
Well, there's obviously been a lot of research done on this. The age of the document seems pretty important. How do we find that out?
Well, a little bit of science and a little bit of day-to-day observation. Modern archaeologists use a sophisticated technique called carbon-14 dating to assess the age of a document. But there is a simpler way, just by looking at the design. Even in our own times, every era has its own style. As with these newspapers, we can learn a lot about any ancient document by looking at the style of writing, the type of letters, and the layout.
So we can compare lots of New Testament documents, some made pretty soon after the originals. Well, what do we have to go on with the Old Testament?
Until recently, the earliest Old Testament documents we had dated from about 900 AD. That was until 1947, when a Bedouin shepherd boy searching for a goat near the Dead Sea made an extraordinary find. While he was searching, he tossed a stone into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. When he looked inside, he found several large sealed jars containing leather scrolls wrapped in linen. Those scrolls turned out to be the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. Among them was the Old Testament book of Isaiah, and when it was compared with this later version, hardly any significant changes could be found, even though 900 years and many generations of copying separated the two documents.
So there's a lot of written, or what you call it, documentary evidence that both the Old and the New Testament have reached us with very little alteration. But what about before things were written down? I mean, did they do that straight after things happened?
No, they didn't usually. Writing was nowhere near so easy and cheap a process as it is today. Most people just weren't used to writing or receiving written messages. What they were used to doing was remembering them and passing them on by word of mouth.
Well, isn't that a bit risky? It's like that game, what do you call it, Chinese Whispers.
Yeah, but it all depends who you listen to, doesn't it? Alas, poor Yorick! I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy.
Tell him, someone.
No, wait a minute.
Someone tell him it's he has borne me on his back 1,000 times.
Oh, put them all out of their misery. Let's go on to the next tape. One of the things many actors find difficult about working in the theatre and TV is learning their lines. But when it comes to the performance, most of us manage to get it right. However, it's not we professionals who hold the records on memory. These Muslim young people are typical of many who learn long passages, sometimes all, of the Quran. And when we look at the source of all records, we find that the greatest recorded feat of memory was achieved by a Buddhist called Bhadanta Visitsara. In 1974 in Rangoon, he recited from memory 16,000 pages of Buddhist holy writings. This Collins English Dictionary has about 1,600 pages. So Bhadanta recited from memory about 10 times this amount. Well, I don't suppose many of us could match that, but experts have shown that in places where people cannot easily write things down, they've trained themselves to use their memories with astonishing accuracy. Now, these are the kind of people responsible for first passing on the Bible accounts. These accounts were then written down and brought together by those who believed they concerned events that were highly significant. Then, as we've seen, copies were made and passed on to us with a high degree of accuracy. Why did it all happen? Well, those involved had their immediate and practical reasons for what they did. But there's another level to the question. Just as I'm planning to leave my things for future generations, Christians believe the fact that we have the Bible is part of God's plan, that his message should be available to generations of human beings. So where does all that leave us? We've investigated the accuracy with which the accounts have been passed on to us. That's science. Why it happened is a question of interpretation. And if we look at how God may have been involved, it becomes a matter of faith. What we can say is that scientific investigation does nothing to rule out the possibility that the Bible is a collection of writings inspired by God and passed on to us in all important respects as they originally existed. In many ways, a time capsule. But it's much more difficult to keep a story alive, accurate, and working in history than it is to bury it at the bottom of the garden. That's a good place to leave part one. Just put the captions back up to remind them how we got to it. So in part one, we looked at how scientific investigation can help us establish to what extent the Bible documents have reached us without substantial change. And we noted some pretty positive results. But were the writers telling us the truth in the first place? That's the big question we're looking at in part two. We start by asking what we mean by telling the truth. Well, now, everything here deals with a different kind of truth. If we were to ask whether the books on the harmonica were telling us the truth, we'd mean, do they describe the instrument accurately? Do they help us to play? And if we asked about the history of rock, we'd mean, does it give accurate information about what people did and the impact they had on others? And the truth of the songs themselves, well, that has to do with how well they capture real emotions and moods. Now, it's a bit like that with the Bible. It contains many different types of literature. They look at different areas of truth and they express truth in different ways.
So how does this all come together in one book or collection of books?
We can illustrate that by looking at an everyday occasion where the same thing happens. Many different types of truth coming together in the same event. Let's go to a football match. Look at these supporters. Their dress, their chants, their enthusiasm, all demonstrate the truth of their commitment to the team. He's pretty sure he's recognized some truth about the way his men are playing, while the truth of the game's laws is upheld by the referee. And if we weren't actually here, we'd have to depend on the truth of reports from the ground. We get most of them via the press box on radio, TV, and the newspapers. An important football match provides a parallel to many of the events described in the Bible. Both involve significant numbers of eyewitnesses, and both are reported to many people who were not present by correspondents. Do we expect all correspondents to report in the same way? How do we expect their reports to back each other up? How much does it matter if most of the reports we read are from supporters of the same side? How far can we check reports? We look for corroborating evidence for the incidents, trends, and movements the Bible describes. At one point, we go back in history to sift evidence. Later, again helped by modern television techniques, we examine in detail some evidence for the birth and spread of the Christian church. Well, what have we got? A collection of Greek letters etched on stone, found in a whole variety of places. But what do they mean? They are, in fact, secret signs used by the first Christians. Take these two letters, a Greek chi, our CH, and a rho, our R. CHR, the first three letters of Christ. This one's a bit more subtle, a fish, or, in the Greek used at the time, ichthus. These characters are the first letters of 5 Greek words. Jesus Christos Theou Huios Soter, or something like that. Translated into English, they become Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. And we consider what conclusions might be drawn.
So if I question whether the Bible describes genuine memories, you're going to ask me how else all this started.
And I bet your answer wouldn't be that different from what's in the Bible. We finish by looking at the significance of eyewitnesses. And I do a bit of thinking about what people might work out about me from the evidence before them. Oh, I imagine that if anyone ever does dig this lot up, they'll figure out that it was put here by a man who fronted bands, had a dozen hit records in the 60s, went into acting and took some lead roles in some fairly well-known plays, presented some television programs, and became interested in the Bible. I suppose I could try to make them believe all sorts of other things I might have wished had happened, such as I beat Boris Becker in straight sets. But although they might believe them for a while, I doubt if it would be long before the truth came out. But this collection of memories involves some rather more significant issues, which some would argue concern the most important events in history, which is probably why experts have scrutinized them for centuries. Because if it's been passed down to us accurately, and we can rely on its writers to report truthfully, and there's a chance that it came from God, that opens up a lot of possibilities.
They'll never work.
Good. Ready to go again?
Well, I've just been running through some more of these Vox Pops. I think you might have a problem with some of these. The Bible might have been passed down accurately, but this lot aren't convinced it was telling us the truth in the first place. Listen to this.
I just need proof in things, and I don't feel there is sufficient proof about anything the Bible pretends to teach us.
It's just a story, really, isn't it?
Stories parents told their children when they went to bed, type of thing.
They needed to believe in things at the time.
It's just fables, isn't it?
Never been proved true, is it?
So half of it's probably not true anyway.
I don't think they're true.
Right, well, the first thing we've got to look at is what is meant by telling the truth. Let's have another look at my box of goodies. There's one problem about this capsule. Suppose they don't recognize the contents when they dig it up. To a blues fanatic, it's unthinkable, but nevertheless possible. Even if they realized that this was a musical instrument, they'd know nothing about the music. So I've got to leave some other clues. Well, they might teach themselves to play, but I'm going to put in a couple of books to help them master the basics. They might want to know more about the great musicians, along with their instruments and achievements. So I'll put in a book about the history of rock music. But a book can't tell them what the music sounded like. So I've included a few of what I think are the all-time great records. And some sheet music so that they can see what it sounded like on their instruments. Well, now, everything here deals with a different kind of truth. If we were to ask whether the books on the harmonica were telling us the truth, we'd mean, do they describe the instrument accurately? Do they help us to play? And if we asked about the history of rock, we'd mean, does it give accurate information about what people did and the impact they had on others? And the truth of the songs themselves, well, that has to do with how well they capture real emotions and moods. Now, it's a bit like that with the Bible. It contains many different types of literature. They look at different areas of truth and they express truth in different ways.
So how does this all come together in one book or collection of books?
We can illustrate that by looking at an everyday occasion where the same thing happens. Many different types of truth coming together in the same event. Let's go to a football match. Look at these supporters. Their dress, their chants, their enthusiasm, all demonstrate the truth of their commitment to the team. He's pretty sure he's recognized some truth about the way his men are playing, while the truth of the game's laws is upheld by the referee. And if we weren't actually here, we'd have to depend on the truth of reports from the ground. We get most of them via the press box on radio, TV, and the newspapers.
I suppose when it comes to the Bible, the type of truth that bothers most people is the reporting. How do we know it was accurate? I mean, for a start, aren't there places where the writers of the Bible seem to remember things differently?
But do we expect exactly the same stories to come out of a well-reported football match? Say England are playing Scotland. England's defenders, all from London clubs, provide rock-solid defence. Scotland make many good runs, but can't break through. But England don't score either, until the game's almost into the last minute when an England forward, of course from Liverpool, slips through and scores a brilliant goal. Scotland fight back, but can't break our London defence. It would be very odd if the London and Liverpool papers reported the game in the same way. As we'd expect, they pick up different aspects, but on important points they agree and back each other's stories. And it's like this with the reports in the Bible.
But if we follow your illustration through a bit further, because the reports in the Bible are all basically written by supporters of the same team, doesn't that make you a bit suspicious that they could have got together and made up stories?
I don't see why it should. Say England are playing Brazil. The reports English people read are likely to be written by those who want England to win. We may be able to see bias in the account, but they can't make up incidents, invent players, or exaggerate things out of all proportion. Of course, if we were really bothered about that, we could check them out against other sources, like the Brazilian newspapers. Now let's take an example from the Bible. Most of the information we have about Jesus comes from the Bible in the 4 Gospels. But books of the Bible aren't the only sources we have available. Of course, Jesus was a Jew, but many of his ideas seemed very strange to a lot of religious leaders of his time. They argued on many occasions, and in the end became bitterly opposed to him. So, if we thought the Christian reports of Jesus might be biased, we certainly wouldn't expect Jewish reports to be biased in the same way. The Talmud is an official collection of sayings from Jewish religious leaders. It covers a long period of time, which begins after Jesus' death. In these writings, we can find a number of references to Yeshu, the name Jesus as the Jews would use it. We're told that he had disciples, although it actually mentions only 5 of them, that he practiced sorcery, presumably what the Gospels describe as his miracles, and that he was put to death on the eve of the Passover. Shortly after the time of Jesus, a Jewish writer called Josephus wrote a history of the Jewish nation. He was careful to avoid issues that might upset the Romans he worked for, but he does include a paragraph about John, surnamed the Baptist, and his death ordered by Herod, and a reference to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Later in another paragraph, he says more about Jesus, referring to his reputation as a miracle worker, his impact on many Jews and Greeks, his crucifixion by Pilate, and to his being founder of the Christians. This provides valuable evidence about Jesus from someone who lived in the same place at about the same time and who certainly wasn't one of his supporters.
And what about the Old Testament? Wasn't that written from the Jewish point of view anyway? Do we have anything from the other side there?
Yes, and this time we've actually got some originals. Stone must have been a real pain to write on, but it does last. These marks, scratched on the side of this stone prism, tell the story of the Assyrians building their empire, sweeping into Israel, besieging Jerusalem, but leaving without capturing it. These tablets from Babylon tell of a later occasion when Jerusalem did fall and many Jews were taken into exile. Both of these are important events reported in the Old Testament. We have accounts from both sides confirming each other.
Okay, so they didn't make up the basic facts. But if you know the final score and the names of the players, you can still lie about what comes in between the main incidents.
Only if you can be certain the truth hasn't been recorded somewhere else. Now, here's a thought. Nobody knows what I'm putting in this capsule, do they? So I can tell the truth, or I can lie. I've spent most of my life singing and acting. Never mind McCartney and Olivier, I could get my fans to put together an article saying that I was the greatest actor and musician of the 20th century. But would future generations believe me just on the strength of that? If it were true, wouldn't they expect to know about it from other sources too? The Old Testament tells us that a small group of slaves found their freedom and became a great nation which discovered God together. The New Testament tells us that Jesus did some remarkable things, that he had an impact on a great many people, and that many people felt he was so important that their whole lives circled round him. Now, if these things are true, we'd expect them to have had some impact on the world, and for there to be other kinds of evidence. Well, what have we got? A collection of Greek letters etched on stone, found in a whole variety of places. But what do they mean? They are, in fact, secret signs used by the first Christians. Take these two letters, a Greek chi, our CH, and a rho, our R. CHR, the first three letters of Christ. This one's a bit more subtle, a fish, or, in the Greek used at the time, ichthus. These characters are the first letters of 5 Greek words. Jesus Christos Theou Huios Soter, or something like that. Translated into English, they become Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Because they were forced to worship in secret, the early Christians could not advertise their beliefs openly. But these signs reminded them of Jesus and tell us what they believed about him. This looks a more complex message. You might have recognized it as an acrostic or word puzzle, but not much more. It's in Latin. But even if you knew the language, it wouldn't make much sense, unless you rearranged the letters. Now, if you did know Latin, you'd know Pater Noster are the first words of the Lord's Prayer, and A and O, Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, representing the beginning and the end. This example was found in England at Cirencester, but one just like it has been found in Pompeii, and that is more significant because we know when it was put there. In the year AD 79, the volcano Vesuvius erupted and covered everything with lava. The lava set like stone and fossilized the city. So, therefore, we now know the belief in Jesus reached Pompeii before AD 79. Why is that important to our inquiry? What should we expect if Jesus had made the impact upon people that the Gospels describe? Nothing to be heard about him for 500 years and then for people to spring up all over the place claiming to be Christians? Or evidence that as time went on, he gradually began to make a wider impact on more and more people? What other evidence do we have? Let's see what history tells us. But rather than looking at the books, this time we'll try and get straight into it. A pretty steady and consistent build-up of supporting evidence. And it wouldn't be hard to do the same thing with the Old Testament and the Jewish religion.
So if I question whether the Bible describes genuine memories, you're going to ask me how else all this started.
And I bet your answer wouldn't be that different from what's in the Bible. When it comes to the New Testament, there's one more important link between the reports and the evidence. Let's go back to the football match. Play that reel again, will you? One of the keys to truthful reporting is remembering that lot, those who were there and saw the event with their own eyes. They're the most critical readers. Getting only the scoreline right wouldn't satisfy them. If a reporter made any attempt to mislead his readers, they'd soon shout. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, it's generally agreed that written accounts were circulating within the lifetime of people who were present at the events described. Unlike a newspaper, read today and thrown away tomorrow, the Gospel documents were studied repeatedly and highly valued. But would they have been taken so seriously if the eyewitnesses had disputed the events reported? In fact, in one of the New Testament letters where St. Paul describes the resurrection of Jesus, he says, Jesus appeared to more than 500 of his followers at once, most of whom are still alive. Presumably what Paul meant was, if you want to check on this, go and ask them. Oh, I imagine that if anyone ever does dig this lot up, they'll figure out that it was put here by a man who fronted bands, had a dozen hit records in the 60s, went into acting and took some lead roles in some fairly well-known plays, presented some television programs, and became interested in the Bible. I suppose I could try to make them believe all sorts of other things I might have wished had happened, such as I beat Boris Becker in straight sets. But although they might believe them for a while, I doubt if it would be long before the truth came out. But this collection of memories involves some rather more significant issues, which some would argue concern the most important events in history, which is probably why experts have scrutinized them for centuries. Because if it's been passed down to us accurately, and we can rely on its writers to report truthfully, and there's a chance that it came from God, that opens up a lot of possibilities. Now, everything here deals with a different kind of truth. If we were to ask whether the book on the harmonica was telling us the truth, we'd mean, does it describe the instrument accurately? Does it help us to play? Having looked at how much of the original writings have reached us intact, and whether they were telling us the truth in the first place, we now look at why the books of the Bible were written in the way they were. We go to a bookshop and make some comparisons with modern books. There's quite a number of similarities between the lives of Jesus and John Lennon. Both grew up in very ordinary homes. Both became famous and made an impact on lots of people. And both died a violent death while still quite young. But let's see how a biography of John Lennon compares with the way the Gospels write about Jesus. There's not much here about John's childhood and school days. When he starts getting interested in music, there's quite a lot more. It reaches a peak as the Beatles become famous, and when he works as a solo musician, there's a significant amount. On the other hand, in Luke's Gospel, we have quite a bit on the events surrounding Jesus' birth. then nothing about his childhood and youth apart from one isolated incident. But then Luke devotes 90% of his book to the last 3 years or so of Jesus' life. When we look at the last few days of their lives, the difference becomes more dramatic. Look at the small proportion John's biographer spends here, and then compare it with Luke writing about the last week of Jesus' life, nearly a quarter of the book. And when we compare it with Mark, we find he gives it even more, over a third of his whole account. A box of old photographs comes in very handy in looking at the question of order in the Gospels. And the old microcomputer is very useful in analyzing the content. If I key into this beast an example of similar passages from each of the first 3 Gospels and ask it to represent them in 3 columns, and then to show all the identical phrases, it looks as if there's been a lot of copying going on. If I put in the whole book, it would show me that nearly all Mark is included in Matthew and Luke. Other large sections of Matthew and Luke are the same. Less than half of any book is significantly different to the others. We look at why the Gospel writers selected from all the possibilities open to them to record the events they did. Take a story almost everyone knows, the first Christmas. Bring on the Christmas cards. Luke, who wants to show that the message of Jesus is for everyone, reports the visit of ordinary shepherds to the stable. So, here they are, Luke's 3 shepherds. Matthew, on the other hand, is writing specifically with Jewish readers in mind, and they were waiting for a Messiah, a leader or king specially sent from God. Christians believe Jesus is the Messiah. So, Matthew describes important foreign visitors, the 3 wise men, traveling a great distance to worship Jesus as king. We use the way the television news is put together in studios, just like this one, to illustrate how the Gospel writers approached their work. Here we sharpened up our thinking on acceptable reporting techniques. Pictures come in from film crews. From these monitors, the director will choose which ones he wants for his program, just as we've been doing.
Well, yeah.
So he might telescope things when a passage of time isn't significant. He'll choose certain individuals to feature, and he'll decide on a headline and group events around it. But this doesn't make those events any less real. The director's not inventing anything. He's using what's there to put over what he feels is most important to get across to his audience. Now, in lots of ways, this is the position in which the Gospel writers found themselves. They'd many sources from which to take material and a limited amount of space in which to convey their news, the good news or gospel. Finally, we look at the question of God's part in all this. The way the Bible came together mirrors the way in which Christians feel God meets them today. There are occasions on which God acts in a very direct and unusual way, but more often it's in the everyday events of life that he's seen at work. So, is the Bible God's time capsule? His message given to the human race, recorded over a long period of time and passed on through the centuries to us? If it is, there are certain questions we have to face. What is God saying to us? Why is he saying it? And what does that mean we should do about it? Good questions. Perhaps ones that should be the subject of their own program. But here we leave you to think about the questions, with the hope that this program has helped provide a framework within which you can go on and explore some of the possibilities this extraordinary collection of memories opens up.
The third section, then. What do we want to say here?
Well, we've looked at the question of how much of the original writings have reached us intact. We've looked at the question of whether they were telling us the truth in the first place. But the question still remains, how did they go about it? Did they write in the same way as modern writers?
Well, why not compare some of the results?
I suppose when it comes to comparing the ways people write, the place to look is the local library. But I must admit, one of my favorite places is propping up the shelves in the bookshop. This shop keeps over 40,000 books in stock. They're divided into about 60 categories, everything from aerobics to zoology. Some people have tried to categorize the books of the Bible. Most of them have given up. It's not an easy job. There are 66 individual books, some compilations of a number of writings. Together, they include a wide variety of authors, aims, and subjects. A book which appears to be just a history of events turns out to have a much deeper meaning when it's studied carefully. Let's take some of the best-known books of the Bible. The four Gospels, bound here as separate volumes. What sort of books are they? You don't have to look for long to see that they're about the life of Jesus. So, are they biographies, like these? Let's look at one for comparison. There's quite a number of similarities between the lives of Jesus and John Lennon. Both grew up in very ordinary homes. Both became famous and made an impact on lots of people. And both died a violent death while still quite young. But let's see how a biography of John Lennon compares with the way the Gospels write about Jesus. Okay, put in the graphics. There's not much here about John's childhood and school days. When he starts getting interested in music, there's quite a lot more. It reaches a peak as the Beatles become famous, and when he works as a solo musician, there's a significant amount. On the other hand, in Luke's Gospel, we have quite a bit on the events surrounding Jesus' birth. Then nothing about his childhood and youth apart from one isolated incident. But then Luke devotes 90% of his book to the last 3 years or so of Jesus' life. When we look at the last few days of their lives, the difference becomes more dramatic. Look at the small proportion John's biographer spends here, and then compare it with Luke writing about the last week of Jesus' life, nearly a quarter of the book. And when we compare it with Mark, we find he gives it even more, over a third of his whole account. The Gospel writers obviously see something very special in Jesus' death. But if their main intention is biography, it's very strange to spend so much time here and nothing at all on so many other things. For example, let's look also at what the authors tell us about the main characters. This book has pictures, but even without them, we'd have some idea of what John Lennon looked like, how his ideas developed, and what his personal thoughts were. In recent years, film producers have made their guesses, but Gospels give us none of this information about Jesus. So what do the Gospels tell us? The word gospel literally means good news, accounts of events, stories, teachings, and sayings collected together as a demonstration of the good news which the writers were convinced Jesus had come to bring. So the emphasis of the books is different, not only in what they tell us, but in how they go about it. This isn't the only biography of John Lennon. If we look at others, they may give us different information, but if they tell us the same things, they'll usually put them in the same order. We have 4 Gospels, and we don't need to look at them for very long before we see that there is no agreed order for many of the events they describe. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke report many of the same events, sometimes in a slightly different order. The Gospel of John often selects other events to report, but where the same events are covered, the order can be significantly different.
Doesn't that make them look unreliable if their accounts are all muddled?
It would if giving a step-by-step account was all the writers were trying to achieve. But this was not something that their intended readers either expected or wanted. We need to help people understand how the Gospels were written before we ask why. Let me give you an illustration. Put up tape 5. Suppose your grandmother gives you a collection of photographs. She always kept them loose in a drawer, but you decide to put them in an album. Many of them show people in places you know or have heard about. The order of some is fairly clear. Grandma as a young girl, before Grandma's wedding. But in other cases, you have to decide. And there are several alternatives. You might group together all the wedding photos. Or you might easily put two pictures of Grandma on the beach at Blackpool next to each other, even though they could have been taken on different holidays. The pictures are no less accurate, but you've grouped them by topic rather than time sequence. Now that's not too different from the way the Gospels were put together. When the early Christians met, they shared memories of Jesus and his teaching. Rather than telling the whole story from beginning to end, they used the parts that were relevant to the occasion. But it's not so much the differences between the Gospel accounts that's been a puzzle to experts, it's the similarities. They don't only tell the same stories, they quite often use the same words. That's okay if the words are Jesus' teachings, which may well have been remembered exactly as he spoke them. But it's more difficult to understand when the words describing an event are the same. The most likely explanation is that one writer came first and the other copied from him. But which one? And to find that out, let's look at an episode from an everyday story of RE teachers. See what's happening on Channel 3.
Nobody was scared they might be killed. First, they did not know what to do and were scared they might be killed. First, they did not know what to do and were scared. Thought I'd heard that before somewhere. See me. All very similar. Bramford, G. Farrand, and Stott.
Of course, in the best schools today, it's not all a matter of work in exercise books. We have computers. If I key into this beast an example of similar passages from each of the first three Gospels and ask it to represent them in 3 columns and then to show all the identical phrases, it looks as if there's been a lot of copying going on. If I put in the whole book, it would show me that nearly all Mark is included in Matthew and Luke. Other large sections of Matthew and Luke are the same. Less than half of any book is significantly different to the others. Now, when it comes to copied essays, a teacher who knows a group of pupils well can probably work out who copied from whom. Similarly, through studying the style of the Gospel writers, many experts believe Mark wrote his Gospel first, and Matthew and Luke copied sections from him, adding extra information from other sources. This theory does not explain all the similarities, and many believe Matthew and Luke also copied from another source. This is known as Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. No complete check can be made, as the document is lost. Because of this close relationship, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The word comes from 2 Greek words, meaning seen together.
Dearie me, that'll seem brought back some memories. Sir, I didn't realise I was risking being put in detention working on your programme. Anyway, never mind me. What about these Gospel writers? They're all supposed to be honest, and they get caught copying.
Ah, well, therein lies an important difference. See, unlike today, copying and editing another person's work without giving any credit was quite usual and legitimate.
Perhaps I could have done pretty well for myself in those days.
Oh, yes, I can just see you alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah, all right, all right. Anyway, you've left one out. What about John? Where does he fit in?
John's Gospel presents its own puzzles. See, it's different in a great many ways from the other 3, but it does provide us with something, a good example of something shared by all 4, and that's the amount of interpretation given to the events. John doesn't just want to record what happened, he also wants to show how it was understood. Let's use a piece of film to illustrate this. He uses an occasion when Jesus healed a blind man to show how the first Christians came to see Jesus as light of the world. And he uses the raising of Lazarus to show their belief in him as the one who conquered death and promised a new life. John was about meaning, giving an interpretation of the facts. That was what fired him. In the other Gospels, interpretation is not so obvious, but it can be seen in various ways. Often this is wrapped up in the selection process. Take a story almost everyone knows, the first Christmas. Bring on the Christmas cards. Luke, who wants to show that the message of Jesus is for everyone, reports the visit of ordinary shepherds to the stable. So, here they are, Luke's 3 shepherds. Matthew, on the other hand, is writing specifically with Jewish readers in mind, and they were waiting for a Messiah, a leader or king specially sent from God. Christians believe Jesus is the Messiah. So, Matthew describes important foreign visitors, the 3 wise men, traveling a great distance to worship Jesus as king. Almost as well known is Jesus' moral teaching. Do for others what you want them to do for you. Turn the other cheek and love your enemies. Of course, it's quite possible that Jesus repeated this teaching on more than one occasion. But it's the way the writers treat it that is significant. Luke scatters it throughout his gospel, but Matthew presents it as taking place on one occasion, the Sermon on the Mount. Now again, we have layers of meaning here. To Matthew's readers, a mountain would have been quite significant. It was on Mount Sinai that God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. And now Jesus is giving his followers God's new law on a mountain. The Jews knew the first 5 books of the Bible as the 5 books of law. So Matthew's gospel presents Jesus' teaching in 5 specific sections. What's the matter? You look worried.
Well, I'm just trying to work out how these techniques fit in with all we've been saying about truth, evidence, and honest reporting.
They fit in very well. In fact, all this technical gear we're surrounded by right now provides a very good illustration of how it works. These studios are used for news broadcasts, right?
Sure.
So pictures come in from film crews. From these monitors, the director will choose which ones he wants for his program, just as we've been doing.
Well, yeah.
So he might telescope things when a passage of time isn't significant. He'll choose certain individuals to feature, and he'll decide on a headline and group events around it. But this doesn't make those events any less real. The director's not inventing anything. He's using what's there to put over what he feels is most important to get across to his audience. Now, in lots of ways, this is the position in which the gospel writers found themselves. They'd many sources from which to take material and a limited amount of space in which to convey their news, the good news or gospel. What no good news reporter must do is distort events to suit their purpose. And there's strong evidence to suggest that the gospel writers avoided this temptation very well. There were many contentious issues at the time about which Jesus didn't speak, and the temptation to add to his teachings must have been very strong. In fact, some experts have pointed out that we can learn a lot from what the Gospels don't say.
It's a good parallel comparing the way the Gospels and the news are put together. I'm surprised I didn't make the connection myself the number of times I've edited the news.
Never mind, no detention this time, especially if you can get those captions working. We'll just run through once. Let's summarize what we've learnt so far. The Gospels are many things, but they are not word-for-word accounts like tape recordings of what Jesus said or of his life. Instead, the writers used a variety of sources, putting already circulating accounts into an order which helped them portray who they believed Jesus was and what he stood for. But on the other hand, they did not substantially alter or invent the eyewitness memories of Jesus' life. As one expert has put it, when the gospel writers intended to provide historical information, that information can be trusted as reliable. The interpretation builds upon the historical information.
Well, that's a good way of looking at it, but I still think it's a pity no one just wrote down the facts and left it at that.
You'd prefer it if they hadn't interpreted the story at all? Tell you what, let's think of the football match again. Run that second piece we did earlier. The way a football game is reported depends on the needs of the audience. A TV commentator doesn't have to give us all the details because we can see where the ball is, but he can use the camera to show us another side of the action. And he can analyze the game by replaying dramatic moments. A radio commentator has to paint a picture of the event. We wouldn't even know the colors of the players' shirts unless he told us. A newspaper reporter has to compress the story into a few lines that will fit on the back page. He's only interested in the bare essentials, but he does have the advantage of hindsight. He knows the scoreline before he writes the story, and he can analyze the implications of the game in relation to all the other results of the season. The same kind of hindsight comes into play in the interpretation we find in the Gospels. The way the writers saw Jesus at the time is of tremendous importance in helping Christians understand his significance today. Throughout this program, we have talked about people being inspired and directed by God. What do we mean by that? Parts of the Bible suggest that some people had a great vision which they went to a lot of trouble to record. But this doesn't seem to be how it usually happened. In this section, we've looked at remembering, collecting, and copying. Our investigations suggest that the Bible came about through these very ordinary everyday activities. So, can it really be God's work? The way the Bible came together mirrors the way in which Christians feel God meets them today. There are occasions on which God acts in a very direct and unusual way, but more often, it's in the everyday events of life that he's seen at work. So, is the Bible God's time capsule? His message given to the human race, recorded over a long period of time and passed on through the centuries to us? If it is, there are certain questions we have to face. What is God saying to us? Why is he saying it? And what does that mean we should do about it? Good questions. Perhaps ones that should be the subject of their own program. But here we leave you to think about the questions, with the hope that this program has helped provide a framework within which you can go on and explore some of the possibilities this extraordinary collection of memories opens up.